Stephen Colbert leaned back in his late-night show chair and flashed that smug comedian smile as he called Vivek Ramaswamy perfect comedy material with questionable intelligence. Colbert's liberal audience erupted in laughter, thinking their host had delivered the perfect takedown. But what Colbert didn't know was that Vivek had researched his entire career of spreading fake news disguised as comedy. Vivek's response about Colbert's propaganda machine and confusion between comedy and reality would completely destroy his credibility and expose the ultimate fake journalist. The Late Show studio was buzzing with the electric energy that had made Stephen Colbert's program a cultural phenomenon for progressive Americans. The iconic Ed Sullivan Theater, with its rich Broadway history and modern television production capabilities, had become the epicenter of liberal political commentary disguised as entertainment. Colbert sat behind his desk with a confidence that came from years of being celebrated as one of America's sharpest political satirists. His perfectly styled hair, expensive suit, and practiced demeanor projected the image of someone who had successfully transformed comedy into a form of political activism that reached millions of viewers every night. Since taking over The Late Show, Colbert had built his brand on a unique combination of humor and political commentary that allowed him to make serious political arguments while maintaining the protection of being just a comedian. His audience consisted largely of educated liberals who appreciated his sophisticated approach to mocking conservative politicians and policies. The show had invited Vivek Ramaswamy for what was billed as a light-hearted interview about his political career and business background. It was supposed to be the typical late-night format where a comedian would ask a few softball questions mixed with gentle mockery, creating viral moments that would be shared across social media by the host's devoted followers. Vivek sat in the guest chair wearing a sharp navy suit, his demeanor calm but alert. He had appeared on hostile media before, but late-night television represented a particular challenge. The format allowed hosts to hide serious political attacks behind the veneer of entertainment, making it difficult for guests to respond seriously without appearing humorless or defensive. The interview had started with the usual opening banter, but everyone in the studio could sense that Colbert was building towards something more substantial. His questions were becoming more pointed, his jokes more barbed, and his audience more engaged with each exchange. "So Vivek," Colbert said, his voice carrying that familiar tone of mock seriousness that had made him famous, "I have to ask you about your political career. Because I'll be honest, from a comedy perspective, you've been absolute gold. Pure comedy gold." The setup was classic Colbert, positioning his criticism as entertainment while preparing to make serious political points. The studio audience chuckled appreciatively, ready for their host to deliver another memorable takedown of a conservative politician. "I mean, watching your presidential campaign was like watching a master class in, well, let's call it confident inexperience," Colbert continued, his timing perfect as the audience laughed on cue. "You had all the confidence in the world combined with, how do I put this diplomatically, a somewhat limited understanding of how politics actually works." The attack was becoming more personal, wrapped in the language of comedy, but clearly designed to undermine Vivek's credibility. Colbert was using his platform to paint Vivek as an incompetent amateur who didn't belong in serious political discourse. "And what really fascinated me," Colbert said, leaning forward with that trademark expression of mock curiosity, "was watching you debate actual politicians who had been doing this for decades. And you seemed genuinely surprised when they knew more about policy details than you did." The audience was eating it up, laughing and applauding, as their host systematically dismantled what he portrayed as Vivek's political pretensions. This was exactly the kind of content that had made Colbert a hero to liberal viewers who wanted to see conservative politicians humiliated. "But here's what I really want to understand," Colbert continued, his voice taking on that familiar tone of fake sincerity. "And maybe you can help me out here, because I'm just a simple comedian trying to make sense of complex political realities." The false modesty was part of Colbert's brand, allowing him to make serious political arguments while maintaining the pretense that he was just an entertainer asking innocent questions. "What makes you think you're qualified for the highest office in the land?" Colbert asked, his voice rising with theatrical incredulity. What in your background suggests that you have the experience, the knowledge, the judgment necessary to be President of the United States? The question was loaded with condescension, implying that Vivek's qualifications were so obviously inadequate that even asking about them was absurd. The audience murmured its agreement, clearly enjoying the spectacle of their host exposing what they saw as conservative delusion. "Because from where I sit," Colbert said, gesturing around the studio, "you look like perfect comedy material. Someone with questionable intelligence who mistakes confidence for competence, who confuses being loud with being right, who seems to think that business success somehow translates into political wisdom." The attack was direct and devastating, designed to paint Vivek as a delusional amateur who had stumbled into politics without understanding his own limitations. Colbert sat back in his chair with satisfaction, clearly expecting his audience to erupt in applause, while Vivek struggled to defend himself. But what Colbert didn't realize was that he had just made a catastrophic miscalculation. He had assumed that his platform as a comedian and his reputation as a political satirist would be enough to intimidate someone he clearly viewed as an easy target. He had no idea that he was about to confront someone who had done extensive research on his own role in spreading misinformation and partisan propaganda. "Stephen," Vivek said, his voice calm, but carrying an undercurrent of steel that made everyone in the studio pay attention, "I appreciate your comedy, I really do. And I understand that your job is to entertain your audience with political humor. But I have to ask you something, and I think your viewers deserve to hear your answer." The tone of the conversation was shifting, and Colbert's confident expression began to falter slightly. He had expected Vivek to laugh along with the jokes or offer some weak defense that would only make the mockery more effective. Instead, Vivek was turning serious and going on the offensive. "You just questioned my intelligence and my qualifications," Vivek continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "You suggested that I'm too inexperienced and uninformed to participate in serious political discourse. You positioned yourself as someone who understands political reality better than I do." He paused, letting his words sink in, his gaze steady and unwavering. "But I have to ask you, Stephen, what qualifies you to judge anyone's political intelligence or competence? What in your background gives you the authority to determine who is and isn't qualified for political office?" The question hit the studio like a thunderbolt, and the audience fell into an uncomfortable silence. This wasn't how these interviews were supposed to go. Guests were supposed to play along with the humor, not challenge the host's authority to make political judgments. "Because when I look at your career," Vivek continued, his voice carrying across the studio with unmistakable authority, "I don't see a political expert or a policy analyst. I see a comedian who has spent decades confusing entertainment with journalism, who has built a career on partisan propaganda disguised as humor." The attack was turning the tables completely, and Colbert sat rigid in his chair, clearly unprepared for this kind of direct challenge to his credibility. "You started your career on The Daily Show, a comedy program that pretended to be news," Vivek said, consulting his mental notes. "Then you created the Colbert Report, where you played a character that was supposed to satirize conservative commentators. And now you host The Late Show, where you deliver liberal political talking points disguised as comedy." The pattern was being exposed in real time, and everyone in the studio could see how Colbert's entire career had been built on blurring the lines between entertainment and political advocacy. "So when you question my qualifications," Vivek continued, "I have to ask, what are your qualifications? You've never held elected office. You've never run a business. You've never had to make decisions that affect real people's lives. You've never faced voters or been held accountable for your political opinions." The distinction between actual experience and entertainment celebrity was becoming clear, and it exposed the fundamental illegitimacy of Colbert's authority to judge political qualifications. "But here's what really bothers me about your approach, Stephen," Vivek said, his voice taking on a tone of genuine concern. "You don't just entertain your audience. You misinform them. You don't just make jokes about politics. You actively spread false information while hiding behind the protection of being just a comedian." The accusation was devastating because it highlighted how Colbert used his entertainment platform to advance political narratives without taking responsibility for their accuracy. Let me give you some examples, Vivek continued, pulling out his phone. During the 2016 election, you repeatedly promoted the Russia collusion narrative, treating unsubstantiated allegations as established fact. You used your platform to convince millions of Americans that Donald Trump was a Russian agent, despite having no evidence to support that claim. The studio was dead silent now, the atmosphere completely transformed from celebration to shocked attention. The audience that had been laughing at Vivek was now confronted with their host's role in spreading false information. For 3 years, Stephen, you told jokes based on a conspiracy theory, Vivek said, his voice rising with conviction. You used comedy to make your audience believe something that wasn't true. That's not satirical commentary. That's propaganda. The revelation was particularly damaging because it showed how Colbert had used his platform to mislead rather than inform, all while maintaining the pretense of being an entertainer. And let's talk about your coverage of the Hunter Biden laptop story, Vivek continued, his momentum building. When that story broke in 2020, you dismissed it as Russian disinformation. You made jokes about it, you ridiculed people who took it seriously, you used your influence to convince your audience that it was fake news. The audience was shifting uncomfortably now, many clearly recognizing the story that had been vindicated long after the election. But we now know that the laptop was real, don't we, Stephen? Vivek asked, his voice carrying the weight of vindicated truth. We know that the story was accurate, that the emails were legitimate, that the evidence of corruption was genuine. So what does that make your coverage? What does that make your jokes? The question was devastating because it highlighted how Colbert's partisan bias had led him to actively suppress accurate information that might have affected electoral outcomes. It makes you complicit in a cover-up, Vivek said, his voice taking on a more intense tone. It makes you part of a media machine that prioritizes political outcomes over truthful reporting. It makes you a propagandist, not a comedian. The room was completely silent now, everyone absorbing the devastating critique of Colbert's role in major political narratives. And let's talk about your COVID coverage, Vivek continued, pulling out another piece of evidence. For 2 years, you used your platform to mock anyone who questioned the effectiveness of lockdowns, the accuracy of mortality statistics, or the wisdom of closing schools and businesses. The COVID topic was particularly sensitive because it affected everyone in the audience personally, and many had begun to question the narratives they had been told. You made jokes about people who worried about the economic consequences of shutdowns, Vivek said. You ridiculed concerns about children's education and mental health. You used comedy to dismiss legitimate policy debates as conspiracy theories or anti-science extremism. The pattern of using humor to suppress dissent was being exposed, showing how Colbert's platform had been used to enforce conformity rather than encourage critical thinking. But we now know that many of those concerns were legitimate, don't we? Vivek asked. We know that lockdowns caused massive economic damage without proportional health benefits. We know that school closures harmed children's development. We know that many of the policies you defended were based on flawed science and political considerations rather than public health. The vindication of dismissed viewpoints was particularly powerful because it showed how Colbert's mockery had contributed to harmful policy decisions. So when you question my intelligence, Vivek said, his voice reaching a crescendo, I have to ask, what does it say about your intelligence that you were wrong about every major story of the past 5 years? What does it say about your judgment that you consistently promoted false narratives while ridiculing accurate information? The questions were devastating because they highlighted the fundamental failure of Colbert's approach to political commentary. How could someone with such a poor track record credibly mock others for their supposed ignorance? But here's what I find most disturbing about your role in American media, Vivek continued, his voice taking on a tone of genuine concern. You've taught millions of Americans to get their news from comedians, to treat entertainment as information, to confuse jokes with journalism. The broader cultural damage was being exposed, showing how late-night comedy had undermined serious political discourse rather than enhancing it. You've created an audience that thinks they're informed because they watch comedy shows, Vivek said. You've convinced people that understanding politics requires nothing more than laughing at the right jokes. You've turned civic engagement into entertainment consumption. The attack on the fundamental premise of political comedy was particularly effective because it highlighted how it discouraged rather than encouraged serious political engagement. And the most damaging part, Vivek continued, is that you've created a false sense of superiority among your viewers. You've convinced them that they're smarter than people who disagree with them, that they understand complex issues better than experts who have actually studied them, that they're morally superior to people who hold different political views. The psychological manipulation was being exposed, showing how Colbert's humor was designed to flatter his audience's prejudices rather than challenge their assumptions. You've turned political discourse into tribal entertainment, Vivek said, his voice growing stronger. You've made it socially acceptable to dismiss opposing viewpoints without engaging with them. You've taught people that mockery is a substitute for argument, that ridicule is a form of refutation. The studio was completely captivated now, everyone recognizing the truth of Vivek's analysis in their own experience of political culture. So Stephen, Vivek said, beginning to stand up, the next time you want to question someone's intelligence, maybe you should examine your own track record of being wrong about major issues. The next time you want to mock someone's qualifications, maybe you should consider what qualifies a comedian to judge political competence. He gathered his thoughts for his final statement. And the next time you want to use your platform to shape political opinion, maybe you should take responsibility for the accuracy of the information you're promoting instead of hiding behind the excuse that you're just a comedian. His final words would echo in that studio long after the interview was over. I'll keep building businesses, creating jobs, and participating in serious political discourse. You can keep confusing entertainment with enlightenment, comedy with commentary, and jokes with journalism. The silence that followed was profound and complete. Colbert sat motionless behind his desk, his authority as a political commentator completely destroyed by the exposure of his role in spreading misinformation and partisan propaganda. His trademark smirk had disappeared, replaced by the uncomfortable expression of someone who had been caught in his own contradictions. The audience sat in stunned silence, many clearly uncomfortable with what they had learned about their favorite late-night host. The other show staff looked around uncertainly, unsure how to respond to such a devastating critique of their program's entire premise. The confrontation between Vivek Ramaswamy and Stephen Colbert had exposed something crucial about American media culture: the dangerous blurring of lines between entertainment and journalism, between comedy and political commentary, between satire and propaganda. It had highlighted how late-night television had evolved from harmless entertainment into a form of political manipulation that used humor to advance partisan narratives while avoiding accountability for accuracy or fairness. Most importantly, it had demonstrated that all the comedic talent in the world couldn't overcome the simple truth that political commentary should be based on facts rather than partisan preferences, that influence came with responsibility, and that the American people deserved better than being misled by entertainers posing as informed commentators. The age of unquestioned late-night political authority was over. The age of demanding accuracy from all forms of political commentary had begun. And it had started with an entrepreneur from Ohio who had the courage to challenge a comedian from New York with the most powerful weapon in politics: the truth about the damage caused by fake news disguised as entertainment.